Hey everyone, what is going on? I'm the Savage Coder and welcome to episode 24. We're going to continue with some JWT authentication, and we're going to focus this time on how to store that token and how to get it into an easy to reuse place where every web call that goes to our API will have that token embedded already, and we won't have to do it every time. So let's jump in, but wait, first, great, so here we are able to log in users, we can sign users up, we can get that token back from our API, and we also learned how to lock down that API. So now that our API is protected, we need to be able to send those calls to the API, but we don't want to be bothered all the time with having to grab that token and resend it. Now, we're not going to deal with token expiration right now. That's going to be in an episode or two, because we have to worry about if that token expires and the API sends us back a 401 because it's no longer acceptable. How do we handle that in the UI and ask the user to log in again? The other thing that we're going to look at is how to get those secrets out of our code and where we can store them so that we can protect our sensitive data. The other thing we'll touch on also in the future is how to lock these things down with app roles. But right now our app doesn't really have different roles. Like there's no admin page that only admins can get to. And so I think we're going to hold off on that. I think right now we're good enough to just be able to use our tokens, and we'll add that when we get to that point. All right, great. So let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into our API project, and we're going to go to our products controller. And I want you to make sure that you have this authorize attribute on all of your product controller actions, which is this get and the get product. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is when we're requesting a token from our UI project, we call out to this request token action with the route API token. And we're going to get back an iAction result, which will give us our status codes of 200 or, whatever the code is. If it's an exception, that'll get thrown as well. But our token, I just want to point out, is a token response object. That's this guy here. It's just a simple class with a string property called token. So we're going to need to, in our UI, expect a token response back, because when we first set it up, we set it up as a string, and that was just kind of a placeholder. So now we're going to update that. So let's move on from the API project and let's bring up our UI project. So looking at our user management, we have an index page, and this view shows us our login. When the user clicks the button to log themselves in, that causes a post to happen, and that calls this login post async. Login post async sends the email and the password that the user sent in. And we send those email and password off to the login async, and that goes to our user management service with login async, and it passes those values through to the repository. So when we log a user in, we package up the email and the password into this user login object, and currently we're using Flurl, a third-party REST client, to call out to /API token at the URL https localhost, our port tacked on to the end of our URL. If we take a look back at the product repository from last week's episode, you can see that we added this with OAuth bearer token, and we hard-coded this token to be sent to our API. This token is long since expired, so we want to be able to set this with OAuth bearer token. We don't want to constantly get a new token and add this line every single time, because that would kind of be a pain. So let's start by dealing with this token that we get back. So here in our login post async, we get this token back, and right now it thinks it's a string. And we need to change that because our API is actually returning a token response object. So I'm going to jump into the repository for login async under user management repository. And when we return this call, if you notice here, it says receive JSON string. Well, that's not what we want. So I'm going to go under models and I'm going to add a class called token response. And then I'm just going to copy from the API's token response that string and do a control RG. So now I've got a token response and I can return a token response from my API call. And immediately this is underlining because the method says it's going to return a string, and that's what's identified in the interface. So we have to update those as well. Before I do that, I'm going to just return this rather than create a token variable and then return it. We can just return this without needing a variable. I'm not doing anything with that. And that's complaining now because we're returning a token response, but our method says it's returning a string. Oops. So let's copy the token response there, and then we're going to redefine this interface in our user management repository so that it also reflects the fact that it returns a token response. We'll bring in the namespace, and it's happy now. And so we have to go back up to the service and do the same thing. So I'll change it in the interface first. I'm just going to make that a token response. And the implementation, I'll change that there as well. And so now if we hover token here, you can see that we get back a token response object. All right, cool. The user has now logged in and gotten a token back. Well, we need to put that somewhere so that we can grab it when we need it. We don't want to have to ask them to log in every 2 seconds just because we need to call the API. So we need a place to put it where it's not going to be forgotten. Because this project is an MVC project, which is a server-side technology, the safest place, I think, to put this is in a cookie that is marked HTTP only. The reason that we put HTTP only on the cookie is that makes it inaccessible to JavaScript. So it protects us from cross-site scripting attacks, and it protects us from any malicious activity because in JavaScript, if you request the cookies, this one won't come back because it's only available on server-side code. So I'm going to rename this token, which is no longer just a string. I'm going to do a control RR, and I'm going to rename it token response because it's actually an object, not just a simple string. And I'll wrap that so we can see it a little better. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a cookie with the value of the token. So cookies are in the response object because in HTTP, we request things and then we receive responses. And that's how we think as a user. But on the server, you're actually receiving something or sending something back. So we receive the request of the post, and as a result, when we send something back, we're going to set a cookie in the browser and we're going to redirect the user to the page that they want to go to next, or the page that we want them to go to next in this case. So we log in and then we go forward them off to the products page. So we are writing out to the browser, so that's our response to the browser. So we can add a response.cookies.append, and we need to give it a name and a value. So we'll have a name and a value. And the name that I'm going to choose is something that's already been defined for us, called Accessor Token. You don't have to call it that. You can call it whatever you like. That's just kind of a standard cookie name for where you store a token. And so I'm going to create a constants class. I'm going to add a class. And we'll call it constants. And what I want to do is I want to call this the same thing that its value is, just in kind of a friendly variable name kind of format. Because it's a constant, I'm going to make it a capital letter. And this will be accessible as constants.xAccess token. And because it's a constant, it acts like a static. I don't need to create an instance of the constants class. So instead of that, I can do constants.xAccess token, and that will just be the string so that I don't have to mistype it. And the value is the token itself, so we can get that from our token response from the line above, and we do a dot token because that's the property on there. There's one more thing we have to do here. This is fine and this will work. But if you remember, I said I wanted to make it HTTP only, and I'm also going to make it same site strict, which means that only code from this site will be able to access the token as well. To do that, I'm going to add cookie options. If I hit comma, you can see that it's telling me there's this cookie options class that you can create to pass all the different options about this cookie you're creating. So I can just do a new cookie options, right? And I don't need that whole namespace. We'll get rid of that and bring in an import for it. I'm going to use the object initialization syntax to set the two properties HTTP only equal true, and same site equals, and this one has this same site mode enum, so I'm going to go ahead and use that, and I can hit dot and do strict. And just to clean this up a little bit, that looks a little better. And then instead of redirecting them to a confirmation reminder, they're actually logging in here. So one of the things we'll want to do is see if they verified their email yet. But since we haven't written code to even send an email, we're going to just kind of skip that for now. And I just want to send them to the main products page because they logged in. So one of the redirect to action overloads is an action name and a controller name. So I'm going to send it to index, which is the default action on the products controller. That will redirect the user to the products controller. They'll hit index, and it will get the products and show that to them. Cool. So now we've stored our cookie, and we've stuffed our token into that cookie. So we can go get that when we need it. So let's make sure we're still building okay. In the last episode, we replaced this system.web.helpers.crypto from the .NET framework with a version that works for us. We actually created our own class that we copied the code from the .NET framework side, and it works great. I would do the same thing here, but we actually moved all of this crypto code into the API, so we don't even need it anymore in here. We're not using it anywhere, but I still have that reference. If we go to the user management service, I can delete this system.web.helpers, and then I can go into the dependencies and remove the actual package, and we should be able to build. Now that we've stored our cookie with our token, when we make our product call to get products, we want that call to the API to use that token. So in order to do that, we're going to end up in the products repository. And in the get products line right now, we have this with OAuth bearer token. So what we want to do is not have to do this every time. And so every time we use Floral, we're having to recreate the same 2 lines of code. And so we don't really need to create a new Floral client every time we need to make a call somewhere. So what we're going to do is we're going to use dependency injection to add an instance of Floral into our repository when we need it. So basically, every time we spin up a repository that has to call the API, we want to already have our Floral client with the base URL in it, and we also already want to have our bearer token set. So if we want to do that every time we create a new repository, it kind of makes sense to have like a base class that this class inherits from that'll do all that work. The downside is that because we're going to use dependency injection, we're going to actually have to get the dependencies for this repository and pass it into the base class. There's really no way to create a base class that you inherit from and not have to pass it those dependencies. You can do it with property dependency injection, but the built-in dependency injection that comes with .NET Core doesn't support that. So you can look into some other packages if you want to try that. We're just going to do it the way that .NET Core allows us to do it out of the box. So 2 things we're going to need. We're going to need access in this repository, or in the base class at least, to our cookies, which is part of our HTTP conversation, right, that the users have with the API, or our code here has with the API. And the other thing that we're going to need to have access to is the Floral client. So we have to go into our startup, and we have to add a couple of things to our dependency injection. So I am going to create 2 duplicate lines here. And if you look on Floral's page under client lifetime, or using Floral with an IOC container, it talks about the issues you have with dependency injection, and it shows you some sample code, how you can use this iFloral client factory and inject that. You can then set your base URL and have this client be available to do client.request. And so that's what we want. We want to be able to reuse the Floral client to do requests. For dependency injection, I'm going to copy this Floral client factory, and originally I was reading the documentation here, and it looked like what it was saying was that you should use, where is it? This default Floral client factory. But after trying that out and running this line of code, the base URL wasn't getting set. And so I found this article on GitHub under Floral where they said you want to use the per base URL Floral client factory instead of a per host or whatever, and the base URL will get set for you. So I already had that problem, so we don't have to have that again. But we're going to replace that with the per base URL Floral client factory. The other thing that we need is we need the HTTP context. Ooh, what is my HTTP context accessor? And that's in Microsoft Asp Net Core.http. And we can just use the HTTP context accessor class. And what this will do is it'll allow us to use one of these in our constructor, and then we'll have access to the request and the response and the cookies and all that kind of stuff so that we can read out the token where we need it from the cookies. All right, so let's do this without any base class stuff, and you'll see kind of why I am leaning towards doing it that way. So we definitely want our iFlural client brought into this class. So let's add a constructor, generate constructor. And we don't want this iFlural client here, because if we look at the documentation, we want this iFlural client factory. So let's change that so that our that's what we registered, right, in the dependency injection was the factory. So that's what we're trying to use here. So we'll bring in the Flural configuration, and this is going to be called Flural client factory. So let's that thing's in my way. Oop. We'll just do it manually. And then the Flural client factory, if you look back at that documentation, you need to do a .get on it with the base URL. So let's do that, .get, and then we're going to put some kind of base URL in there. Grab that from right here. So now we got the base URL. And then what we want to do is we want to set the Flural client, you know, this with OAuth bearer token on that client from our cookie. So essentially we want to Flural client dot with OAuth bearer token, and here we want to put in our token. So how do we get the token? Well, that was that other one that we created there, which is a private read-only HTTP context accessor, and we'll call that HTTP content accessor, and we will bring in the namespace for that one as well. And then we also need to add that to our constructor. So let's kind of reformat that so it's easy to see. Next, I'm going to take this with OAuth bearer token, and I'm going to make that last because that's really kind of the last thing we want to do once we have our token. So now that we have our context accessor, we can use that to get the cookies. So I can say var token, because a cookie is just a name, which is a string, like a key, and a value, which is a string. So the token is equal to the HTTP context accessor dot HTTP context. That'll give us our current request and response and stuff like that. So we're looking at the request this time, because we already wrote the cookie out with the response, and now the website is calling out to us to say, hey, I want to see all the products, and here's all my cookies. Use what you need out of them. So they're requesting products from us. So it's in the request is where the cookies will live. So if I do request.cookies, there they are. And now I just need to give it the name of that key. Well, the name of the key we put in our constants. So again, I can just use, instead of the quotes, constants dot x-access token, and let me just wrap that a little bit so that you can kind of see how that looks. Right, so now token is a string with our actual token in it. So we can use that. We should probably make sure that there's something in there. So we can put like a if not string.is null or white space. In other words, if there's something in the token, then go ahead and set that token. That way, if there's nothing there, it won't try to do anything. And so now we've stuffed our token inside our Floral client, and now we can go here, and instead of doing this code, we can say return await, but this time we're going to call the Floral client dot request, right? We got that from the docs back here, Floral client dot request. And now it wants our URL segment. Well, that's this, right? We were appending this path segment before anyway, so it kind of needs the same thing. We don't need the base URL. That's already in there. We just did the segment. We don't need to put our bearer token in because we did that up here. So now we just really need to call this same last part. And so that's a lot less typing than all of this. So I kind of like that better. But the problem is every time I want to create a new repository class, I already have users and products. There's going to be a lot more in here. I don't want to have to do this every single time I do that, because that's a lot of typing. So let's go ahead and create a base class for our repository, and I'm going to call that repository base. And pretty much what we're going to do is we're going to move all that stuff into here. So we don't need those. We'll put those in here. And we can bring in those namespaces. Right? We need these two requirements on the constructor. So let's got my cap locks on. So I can put those two in here. Clean that up a little bit. And then we can take this code, all of it, and put that in here. So now we've got this base class that needs to get past the factory and the HTTP context. And it'll create a client, it'll add the token to the bearer section in the headers, and give us something that we can use. And so all we'll need to do is this kind of code here. Well, if you notice, I got rid of Floral client from my product repository. So how can I have access to that from the base class? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to inherit all of this functionality into our product. So after the colon, I'm going to put repository base, and our products repository now inherits repository base while still implementing the interface from iProducts repository. So that means that this class is one of these classes. So immediately it's saying, hey, I have a problem here because you told me that I am a repository base. And if we look at repository base, in order to create one, right, in order to call the constructor and create one, I need you to pass me these two things. Now, normally, dependency injection did that. But now that it's a base class, the child is actually going to have to create the parent. So what we want to do is we want to put a little colon here, and we want to call the base. And we can call the constructor from the base class with the word base, and then passing in our parameters here. And the two parameters are the two things that it needs, which is the client factory and the context. So we'll leave that there so you can read it. So now when we create our products repository, dependency injection will send these two guys. And then we just take those two variables, now that they're populated, and we send them into the base class. And the base class takes those in and runs this code. So the only other thing we need to do here is we need to make this private variable, Floral Client, available to this products repository. It doesn't have a Floral Client here, and it can't see it. And you can see it even tells you repository base has one, but it's inaccessible due to its protection level. That's because it's private. So if we make this protected, so that children of the repository base can actually get to it, then that error goes away and we don't need this code anymore. So now when we create new repositories, we just need to add an empty constructor that takes these two items in and then just pass them to the base. We don't have to actually do anything with them. The base class will take care of that. And so even though this just looks like a simple request to an endpoint that gets back something, it actually is going to send the bearer token to the API. So not sure this is going to work right off the bat, but we're going to give it a shot. So I'm going to first run my API on my other monitor. All right, API is running, and now I'm going to run our UI code. And let's put some breakpoints in there. So actually, before we hit start here, I want to change the startup page. So I'm going to go all the way to the bottom of my startup, and I'm going to change my default controller to user management. And the action can stay indexed because I want this to start at the login page. So there's our login page. I have my form filler filling in the text boxes. And I'm going to click login. And so login runs the post. I already called the API. I got my token response. You can see my token is in there. It's that big long thing there. And I'm going to stick that into a new cookie. And I'm going to redirect to the products page. So I'm going to go to the products repository. I'm going to put a breakpoint in the get products, and I'm going to put a breakpoint in the base class so that we can watch all that magic, and then I'm going to let it go. So first thing that happens is repository base is getting called with the client factory and the HTTP accessor. So we create our Floral client. The base URL should be set in there. It is. That's what we set right there. And then we grab our cookie, and the value of our token is the bearer token that we stored in our cookie earlier. So is it empty? No. So we'll go ahead and stuff that token into our bearer token. And if I let that go now, it calls get products, which will call out to our API products. And if I let it go, you can see that we have 3 products coming back, and I haven't fixed the images yet. We can do that. I kind of started doing it. It's not the prettiest thing, but if we go to our www.root assets images, and I'm going to open that up in another folder. Notice the images there are named 1, 2, 3, and if we look at our actual inspection of the image, it's looking for /assets/images/guitar1.jpg, and that doesn't exist in that folder. I've already gone in the database and I added /assets to the beginning. The database used to just have images guitar1, so that'll have to be updated. I will update the database script, so you can just rerun the seed script and it'll erase the old values and put in the new ones. And so let me copy those three in there. Let's see what that does. Debug, disable all breakpoints so that we can just test those images. Okay. So there's only 3 coming back right now. And that's because the database, the stored procedure is looking for things that are true and not sold. So there's only, those top 2 are true and false. And then this ancient artifact is also true and false. Everything else doesn't match, so it's not bringing those back. There was also a bug in the STP items get. I removed all of the joins from, let me see if I can still undo that. Yeah. So these inner joins were in there, putting the tags in, which we don't need yet. And they're probably not going to come back here anyway, so I took those out. And then I just re-executed this because it was bringing back duplicates. And so while it's not the prettiest because the pictures are all different sizes, I got them from all over the place, at least it's working somewhat. So we have one final problem to solve, and then we are good. I was just thinking about how we implemented our tokens, and I'm not really happy with it. There's a big security hole in doing things the way that I just did them, and that is that this constructor for our repository base only gets called when the repository child calls it. And so it will read properly the token out of the cookies, and it'll set it with an OAuth bearer token. The problem is this never gets called again. So if you're on the same computer and you log out and you have someone else log in on the same browser instance, it's not going to call this class again because in our startup, we have this as a singleton. So once it creates one of these product repositories, it won't create it again. It'll keep it around and it'll just reuse this instance, which is normally great, but it creates a repository class at that same time, and that has the same lifetime. So this OAuth token will still be set as the authorization header from the first user and will never change until the cookie expires. So we need to make sure that this runs every single time, not just when the repository base is fired. So what we're going to do, the code that we have here is still good. It's just that we want to fire this code right here every single time we request a client factory. So I went and I looked at the Floral configuration, which has all their events, and there's this before call. And before call is an event on the Floral client, and it'll get called every time you try to make a call through Floral. So for each of these in our product, for each of these get JSON async, every time you call a get, it's going to run through that event first, and it'll do whatever it says in there. And that's kind of exactly what we want, right? Before you make this call out to the API, do this. And what we want to do is we want to set up the correct token from the current user's cookie. So I'm just going to go under Floral Client, and I'm going to use this before call. And if I look at the overloads here, I can either just pass in a Floral call, or I can do a function. And I think that's what I want to do is a function call. And the parameter for the function call is a Floral call. So let's do that. I'm just going to call that argument Floral call, and then we'll make an anonymous function like that. And then everything that happens inside here will happen before the call. And we'll have to see what this Floral call is but we know that this is a variable that represents the current call. And so what we want to do is we kind of want to do this. We want to set the bearer token in the header. Now, I don't know if we're going to have this convenience method here because that's really on the client and we're dealing with a call, but let's see what we get. So floral call dot, oops, might work if I did my capitalization. Oh, that's why I misspelled it. Floral call. Okay, now they match. So floral call dot, let's see what we got here. Let's go to the top. Completed exceptions. So maybe something in the request message. We don't want to redirect. That's all we got. So let's go into the request and see what's in there. The method would be like post or get. We don't want to change that. We don't want to change the URL where it's going. We do want to change the headers. That would give us a collection of all the headers. So we could look for the right header that we want and replace the value. So that would work. Possibly. There's another headers, gets the collection of headers. Kind of sounds like the same thing. Set header. Set header takes a name and a value. I mean, that's what we want to do. We want to set a header. So I'm going to do that. And set header takes a name and a value. So we'll have a name and a value. And so we know the value is this token. But since we don't have this convenience, really what we're doing is kind of what Postman does. So we can steal the spelling and capitalization and all that stuff. So when we made a call to our ping, see if we can find that one. Protected ping. So protected ping, we set our token in the bearer token, but if we show those hidden variables, you can see the authorization is the one we want. So I'm going to go to this bulk edit mode, and I'm going to, it doesn't allow it. So just so we can do it manually, I'm gonna copy this old token just so we can see it, and I'm gonna set this to inherit auth from parent, and I'm gonna add an authorization token, and then we put bearer space and the token. So if we look at that in bulk edit, this is kind of before the colon here. That's the name we want. So I'll copy that. So we'll put that in there. And then we have for the value, the word bearer space. And if we use interpolation here, we can, after the space, add the token. And that's this token. So we're not creating this token until outside of here. So like I said, before each call, we want to do all of this. So let's grab all of this and cut it and put it inside this before call. And then we actually want to do what we set up here instead of this OAuth bearer token. We also, this doesn't belong inside here. This belongs inside the constructor, because that's just the dependency injection calling in and setting this variable. So then we create a floral client with a URL, a base URL, and then before each call, we'll grab the token out of the current user's cookie. As long as there's a token there, go ahead and set the authorization. If there's no token there, so else, I think what we want to do is get rid of that. So I think the best way to do that, just make an empty string, or the better way would be string.empty. And so we'll kind of erase that header because the cookie didn't exist. And so now if I put a breakpoint in here and we run this, I think what we'll see is that each time a user makes a request, it refreshes that authorization header from the current cookie. So one simple little mistake like that could really be a huge security hole. So I'm going to log in as savage.coder, and there's our before call, right? Where we go, we get our token out of the cookie and we set it in the header. And if all goes well, then we get back our products. And if I go after that and I log in as another user I have called test.user, then it calls it again and it reads that cookie. And don't forget, every time I log in, the code that we put in the login, right, in the user management controller, as soon as we log in, we are adding that cookie. So we're overwriting it every time once we log in. So we're always getting the correct one here. So now we're good. All right, so that does it for this episode. We learned how to get our token back from our API, put it in a cookie, and before each call to our API, we update the bearer token that we send to the API so that it knows we're authenticated and we're able to access the protected resources on its endpoints. And we learned how to hook into our REST client so that every call we make gets hooked in an event. We can modify our header in each call. We also learned how cookies can have limitations put on them so that we only read them in server-side code, or if we need them in JavaScript, and same site restrictions as well. And we were able to update a couple of images in our project and fix the stored procedure bug. So I'll update all those scripts. And as always, if you found this helpful at all, please subscribe. I do appreciate that. And practice as always. Just keep doing this stuff and it becomes second nature like anything else. So make yourself do this, even if it's just pulling down my code and stepping through it and understanding and maybe making a couple of changes, just so you make sure that you kind of reinforce what you just watched. All right, so that's it for me, and I'll see you online. put it in a cookie, protect that cookie from JavaScript so we don't have any attack surfaces that are as vulnerable as they could be. We have injected our Floral client, our REST client, and we're able to set up the bearer token once so that we don't have to keep doing it over and over again. Will that work with multiple users? Ooh, I didn't think about that. Let's see. I think that's the whole per base URL Floral client factory. Ooh. Let's see, Floral with OAuth bearer token. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's going to work. Let's try. Okay, so okay. Now let's see. I need to see. what happens here? Hmm. Let's try that.